Welcome back to Law and Crime, everybody. You are watching and listening to a live feed into the Reverend Shaun Harrison case, a Boston pastor who's on trial for a lot of different crimes, including the attempted murder of a high school student named Luis Rodriguez. On the stand right now is Eric Savick, a fingerprint examiner, going over what prints he found on items of evidence that were collected from Mr. Harrison's apartment. And I want to talk more about the collection of evidence in this case with my very special guest, criminal defense attorney Mark Eigharsh. Mark, there was a lot of things that were collected from Harrison's apartment, including guns, ammunition, drugs. I find the collection of evidence in this case to be very interesting. What do you think of it?
Well, in terms of the case, he's got the perfect cover. You see, if he didn't have this cover, and he was just some reverend who had no contact with any youngsters at all, and he worked maybe in a church and then didn't see people in his house privately, he wouldn't have an explanation for this. But he's got the perfect explanation. He was trying to help the youngsters in the community. They would leave things behind to, sometimes with his knowledge, sometimes without. Anything that's found, he's going to say didn't have anything to do with him, had to do with these kids that clearly needed the help.
Now that is a great tactic, and I wonder if the defense, when they're handed the case after the prosecution rests, if they will kind of do a flavor of that. Maybe they'll take a play from the Mark Eigharsh playbook. Maybe we'll see. It's a very good point because, as he said, as Mr. Harrison kept saying, he was a community activist, wanted to help the youth, wanted to make everybody good. We're going to take a quick break. We'll be right back. Stay tuned. Welcome back to the Law and Crime Network and Law and Crime on Sirius XM Radio Channel 109. I'm Jesse Weber. Now, before we get into our main case of the day, the main case that we've been covering here on the program, which is the Shaun Harrison case, I want to take a minute and tell you about something that we're doing here on the network that we're very excited about. Law and Crime is creating a series of podcasts that you can go to iTunes and subscribe to. We're going to do a whole series of them. And one of the first ones is one that you might find very interesting. It's called Pursuit of Justice with Lise Wheel. She's one of our very own hosts here. Lise will be exploring all kinds of topics. She's going to be talking about political stories, crime stories, and just justice in general. And she's going to do it from a legal lens and getting to the bottom of what's really happening. So I recommend you listen to this podcast. You can go onto iTunes and subscribe, and we'll let you know about any other podcasts that come down the way. Again, that is Pursuit of Justice with Lise Wheel. Now let's take a step back, and we are going to go to Massachusetts right now. We are live in a courtroom out of Massachusetts. It's the Shaun Harrison case. Let me rephrase. It's the Reverend Shaun Harrison case. That's right. A Boston pastor is on trial. He's in a lot of hot water. He's on trial for gun charges, drug charges, as well as the attempted murder of a high school student named Luis Rodriguez. It is alleged that Mr. Harrison was leading a double life as a drug kingpin. On one hand, he was the dean at a high school. He was a community activist trying to help the youth. And the other, he was really dealing drugs. And not only that, enlisting the help of high school students to help him sell the drugs. It's alleged that Mr. Rodriguez, the victim in this case, was one of those students. And what happened? They had a dispute over decreased drug sales, and it's alleged that Harrison lured him out one night and shot him in the back of the head, execution style. Rodriguez survived and testified in open court against Harrison, pointing the finger at him. And speaking of fingers, we're talking about a fingerprint expert right now, a fingerprint examiner. Eric Savick is on the stand, and he's examining fingerprints that were found on items in Harrison's apartment, including, and I'm looking at the feed right now, this might be the gun that was maybe used in connection with that shooting. I'm not sure. Let's go live into the courtroom right now. Welcome back to Law and Crime, everybody. So we are covering a very interesting case out of Massachusetts, the Reverend Shaun Harrison, a reverend who's on trial for gun charges, drug charges, as well as an attempted murder charge. Let's bring back in criminal defense attorney Mark Eigharsh. And I love speaking to Mark, but if you want to speak to Mark, go to speaktomark.com. You can speak to the man himself.
Can I speak with you for Jesse? Wait, I got to ask you. I keep hearing you say reverend. Did anybody vet that? What makes him a reverend? Because he says he's a reverend? Did he go to some reverend school? I'm just curious.
Well, Mark, he calls himself the Rev, and people of the clergy, members of the clergy who knew him and worked with him, said, we were surprised when all this came down. Now, is he actually qualified as a reverend? I think we'll have to do a background check on him fully. But from all accounts, he seems to be a reverend.
Yeah, from here on out, I want to be known as Mark, the NBA player. Just call me that. That's what I want to be known
as. Well, how tall are you? I mean, I don't know how your jump shot is. I don't know what your qualifications are. We will have to ultimately say.
I'm calling myself the NBA player. He's reverend, even though he's an alleged drug dealer and murderer. But, you know, we'll see.
I mean, it sounds good. It sounds good to be calling yourself the Rev. I mean, that's really what's so funny is when he did police interviews, he said, look, I'm not a gang member. I'm not a drug dealer. I'm the Rev. I'm the Rev. So I got to tell you, one of the interesting aspects about this case is when he got arrested, people in the community were shocked. Shocked. They said, I knew this guy. I had no idea this was happening.
They don't know anything. Nobody knows anyone. People, listen to me, including my own clients. Just listen to me. Nobody knows anyone. Stop acting surprised, people. I'm not saying that he's guilty or not, but this notion that you know anyone is foolish and the height of arrogance. You know only what people want you to see. They're actors. Get that through your heads.
It's a good point. You really don't know anybody, and we cover so many cases where you see these happy couples and there's a murdered spouse, and the question is, well, they seemed so happy. How did anything happen? So it's always interesting. I want to ask you, Mark, one quick question before we jump back into court. I've been asking this question too. If you were going to murder someone, so again, Harrison is on trial for attempting to murder Luis Rodriguez by shooting him in the back of the head, execution style, back in 2015. There's surveillance footage of what appears to be the shooting, and you see two men walking in the snow when one appears to shoot the other and then run away. If that really is Harrison, and if that really is the shooting, why do it in that way? Why do it out in the open like that?
Okay, this sounds to me like whoever did this, their blood was probably boiling. They probably didn't have time to think about it. They just did it, right? They were probably upset. They might have been upset that, you know, drug sales weren't going, or they felt cheated, or maybe the person said something that pressed one of his buttons, you know? That's why.
That's a big point. Our last guest mentioned that, too, that perhaps they were having a conversation, an argument, and something snapped, and right at that moment he shot him.
That's what I think happened, yeah.
Yeah. Well, Mark, here's what we're going to do. We're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we're going to go either live into the courtroom, depending upon what we hear in that witness that's now on the stand, or Mark and I are going to talk a little bit more about this case because it really is a bizarre one out of Massachusetts. We'll be back in a minute. Welcome back to the Law&Crime Network. That is our top legal crime stories. Really interesting stuff. Thanks, Anthony, for that report. But we have to switch gears right now because we want to talk about the main case that we're covering here, the Reverend Shaun Harrison. Again, this guy who, as I said, we were talking with Mark Eigharsh earlier, if he's a reverend or if he's not a reverend, he claims to be a reverend, and people in the community believed him to be a reverend. So this guy is on trial for being an alleged drug kingpin, but also attempting to murder a high school student named Luis Rodriguez. Harrison was one of the deans at that high school, and it's alleged that he recruited him to be one of his drug dealers. They had a dispute about drug sales, and he tried to take him out. On the stand right now, we have a live feed into that courtroom, is Joseph Ross. He's a DNA expert. Let's learn a little bit more about what he found in connection with this case. We're going to go live. All right, everybody, welcome back to the Law&Crime Network. That was Joseph Ross, a DNA expert testifying in the Shaun Harrison case out of Massachusetts. Let's bring back on criminal defense attorney Mark Eigharsh. Mark, I got an interesting question for you, and one of the things that makes this a unique case, again, we're talking about a man who claims, as you said, to maybe claims to be, maybe not actually is, a reverend who's on trial for attempted murder as well as gun charges and drug charges. The interesting thing is the majority of witnesses that have come forward to point the finger at Harrison have been high school students. Now, who am I talking about? I'm talking about first the victim, Luis Rodriguez, is a high school student, claims that Harrison tried to shoot him and kill him. Then you have Kevin Perez, who's another high school student, and says that Harrison asked him to sell drugs for him and actually asked him to take out Luis Rodriguez himself. When you have these kind of witnesses who come forward, and let's not also forget, maybe this may taint a jury, they said themselves they would smoke marijuana a lot, they'd be involved with it. How's a jury supposed to look at the credibility of these high school students?
Well, very cautiously. So that's why prosecutors put on the last two witnesses, not just because every juror is into the whole CSI effect and they want fingerprints and DNA on everything or an explanation as to why there is no DNA or fingerprints on something, but they need to corroborate or support the testimony of all of these teenagers who, by their own admission, use marijuana, perhaps carry guns, perhaps run marijuana and guns for the reverend, the accused. So they're going to have questionable credibility, and that's why they have to corroborate everything that they're claiming.
I mean, you had another student named Jose Nova who's like, I don't want to be here. I don't want to be in this courtroom. I don't want any part of this. So it's interesting that they brought that out first by the prosecution saying, look, it's not like this witness has any incentive to come here and testify. He doesn't want to be here. But having the victim, okay, if this is all true, miraculously this boy survived a shot to the head, and now he comes into court and points the finger at Harrison. Is that the strongest possible testimony that the state can have?
Not necessarily, because it hinges upon whether he's credible or not. There may be reasons why he's pointing the finger at him as opposed to somebody else, right? He couldn't just say, no, it was an accident. I fell down steps, right? So he had to finger somebody. Let's start with that. And maybe it's somebody who, he's a lot more scared of than the reverend, in quotation, and doesn't want to point his finger at that person. So he points his finger at the reverend. Or, let's just say more innocently, he believes it was the reverend, but it's not. Believability and accuracy are two different things. You could be certain of something, but be dead wrong of it.
And we can't forget the fact that Mr. Rodriguez was pressed under cross-examination about why he first didn't identify Harrison as the shooter. And he said, well, I was shot. I was trying to make sense of things. Very well possible. Or as Mark said, maybe there's something a little bit there that jurors have to think about. We're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we have a lot more in the Reverend Shaun Harrison case. Welcome back to the Law&Crime Network, everybody, and Law&Crime on Sirius XM Radio. I'm Jesse Weber. We're covering the Reverend Shaun Harrison case, and who was just testifying was a key witness, Kevin Perez. So this guy, Harrison, this defendant, is on trial for drug charges, gun charges, as well as an attempted murder charge in connection with the shooting of Luis Rodriguez. This victim, Rodriguez, survived, actually, and testified in open court that Harrison shot him. Well, Kevin Perez, who we've been playing the testimony of, also said that Harrison was a drug dealer and that he asked him at one point to attack this boy Harrison, this boy Luis Rodriguez. It's a really bizarre case. So I want to talk about it one more time with criminal defense attorney Mark Eigharsh. Now, Mark, if this is all true, okay, so if Harrison was operating as one of the deans and he operated this criminal enterprise from the school, he had marijuana, he was giving people marijuana, he was enlisting the help of high school students to help sell marijuana, he tried to take out one of these high school students. If this is all true, how on earth could this guy get through the school system and become one of the deans at the English high school?
He's good. He's really good. Most of the people that I defend who live double lives are really good at keeping the bad stuff from anyone knowing about it.
And, I mean, we keep seeing it in the news. Teachers fooling around with students. I mean, I just don't get how it keeps slipping through the cracks.
Listen, money's good, baby. He wants to keep rolling it in, allegedly. But I want to go back to something you had asked me earlier. You had said, so the victim's testimony is the key or the most significant piece of testimony. And I say no. To me, I start with the videotape, which I still have not seen. I don't know if you have.
So you're talking about the videotape of the actual shooting?
Yes.
Let me just back that up for a second. For anybody joining us, there is surveillance footage from a nearby gas station that captured two individuals that were dressed in very dark clothing walking in the snow. Very hard to tell who's who. What it appears to be is one person standing behind the other has an outstretched hand. It looks like a shooting. One falls to the ground and the other runs the opposite way. It's grainy. You can't tell who's who, but the prosecution has used it to say, ha ha, that is evidence of the shooting.
It so reminds me of an armed robbery case I had in federal court where prosecutors promised the jurors an opening statement they were going to see a videotape with still photos taken from that videotape that clearly show that it's my client, albeit slightly grainy. And I won that case 2 out of the 3 times I tried it. The third time they introduced his entire criminal history in front of the jury. I thought that was completely unfair. But the first 2 times, without the criminal history, the jurors did not agree that my client was guilty. We hung the jury up, which was a huge victory. And that's because they were dissecting the videotape. They were looking for anything that supported or negated the theory that this was the defendant. And I think that's what these jurors are going to do in this case.
I mean, how often do you get the actual crime on camera? If I were them, I'd be looking at that constantly as well. And maybe that's what they will ultimately do. And maybe they'll say, maybe they'll be split. They'll say, hey, we think there's enough evidence to say on these gun charges and these drug charges, but they're not convincing me so much about this attempted murder charges. So, Mark, we'll have to see. I know we have to sign you off. It was great having you on. I love speaking to you, but you can go to speaktomark.com to speak to him. And also, as I said earlier on in the program, if you want to feel a little happy and you don't want to be so drowned out by all the negativity, Mark made a great speech on Twitter. You can follow him on Twitter where he really gave a great speech on happiness. So I recommend you check that out. As always, Mark Eigharsh, great to have you on.
Take care, Jess. Be well.
All right, everybody, here's what we're going to do. As we wait for the live feed to be back in the Shaun Harrison case, and today's been an interesting day of DNA experts and fingerprint experts, I want to continue playing for you the testimony of Kevin Perez. Again, this other student at the school who testified about what Mr. Harrison was talking to him about. He said he saw Mr. Harrison giving marijuana to students. He asked me to sell marijuana for him. He even asked me to attack Luis Rodriguez, the victim. Let's listen to how he did under cross-examination.